If the definition of terrorism is targeting innocent civilians to force a political agenda, then a closer look at history reveals the troubling fact that governments have been engaging in terrorism.
One of the reasons that states have never been able to agree in the context of United Nations negotiations on the definition of terrorism is it's never been possible to find a form of words which excludes the possibility that states could in some way participate in terrorist act. In short, of course states can be engaged in terrorism. If a state places an explosive or uses military force in a random way, harming civilians as part of a political objective, it may well meet the definition of terrorism in that 1997 convention.
Terrorism has been practiced by both governments and militants. In fact, before I did my work on terrorism, I spent 15 years studying air power. I wrote a book called Bombing to Win, which looked at all the uses of air power by states from World War I through the first Gulf War. Over 40 cases, major cases of air power in all. And in many of those cases, air power was used by states to bomb civilians in the hope that bombing those civilians would produce political outcomes. In fact, that's often called terror bombing because it's a form of terrorism.
As the Second World War continued to expand, the deliberate bombing of cities and civilian populations by both the Axis and the Allied powers increased significantly. This was known as strategic bombing and was used as a psychological weapon to break the enemy's will to fight, to decrease its industrial production, and to push the civilian populations to revolt against their regimes. The strategic aerial bombardment in the European theater claimed the lives of over 60,000 British civilians and over 300,000 German civilians. Doubt about the effectiveness of bombing civilians in a conflict comes from the fact that despite the bombing of German cities, the country's industrial production increased throughout the war.
When you bomb civilians, it tends to almost always congeal the support of the civilians against you. That is, the civilians come to hate you. They come to see you as evil incarnate. We may tell ourselves, or the British may tell themselves, they're the good ones here and Hitler's the evil one. But who's killing 300,000 German civilians here? You see what I mean? So the German civilians are very much hating the British, causing them to fight on and make much greater sacrifices than they otherwise would, and in fact to support Hitler in doing some of the nastiest things Hitler was doing at the time. So that what's happening here is that this is backfiring in just about every way imaginable.
On Monday, the 6th of August, 1945, after 6 months of intense firebombing of 67 Japanese cities, an atomic bomb dubbed Little Boy was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by the detonation of a second bomb named the Fat Man over Nagasaki. As many as 140,000 Japanese civilians were killed as a result of the initial blast. And within weeks, the death toll increased to 250,000 as a result of radiation sickness. Within 5 years, the death toll exceeded 500,000 as resulting cancer and other long-term effects took hold. These are, to date, the only attacks with nuclear weapons in the history of humanity. During World War II, the Nazi regime committed a horrific genocide, killing civilians of non-Aryan ethnicities throughout Europe. Millions of Jews, Polish, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Gypsies, and trade unionists were prosecuted and killed. In 1948, 50 years after Theodor Herzl established the first Zionist Congress, the State of Israel came to being, imposed on the land of Palestine. From this declaration onwards, using weapons recognized internationally as inhumane and illegal, the Israeli troops carried out systematic persecution, assassination, and mass killing of Palestine, including children. Tens of thousands of innocent Arabs were killed, and more than 5 million became homeless. Most of them became refugees in neighboring countries.
This is called state terrorism. For me, terrorism is when innocent civilians are targeted, no matter who targeted them, whether killed by so-called militants or government military forces. It is a crime and an act of terrorism.
Where's the case? Where's the case where bombing civilians with conventional bombs has actually won a war? We don't have very many. Maybe one, maybe two out of 40, 50 instances. That's not very much. And even those are probably apocryphal, probably not true. When we look at these cases, as I said, 40 cases from World War I to the 1991 Gulf War, many involving air power against civilians, we find no instances of that air power actually causing those civilians to abandon control of territory or to rise up and produce a popular revolt against their own government. In other words, it's not just that bombing civilians is immoral, it's ineffective. And that's a key message, because many people believe that in war we should kind of put morality aside and we should do what works. Well, if bombing civilians doesn't work, then what is the case for bombing civilians?